Prologue: the arrow was meant for his heart. It struck mine instead. Not because I was brave, because I was standing where I always stood, 18 inches behind the Alpha King's left shoulder, in the position assigned to the Crown Advisor during public ceremonies. The position I had occupied for 2 years. The position I would have died in, and very nearly did, for a man who had spent the last 6 months planning my destruction. I did not know about the plan. Did not know that the king I served, the king I had reorganized the treasury for, the king whose military intelligence I had restructured, the king whose council meetings I had been attending since dawn every morning for 730 days. That king had been compiling a case against me for half a year, a dossier of fabricated evidence, a network of manipulated testimony, a strategy for my arrest, trial, and execution that was scheduled to be executed in 11 days. 11 days. I was 11 days from being arrested for treason by the man I took an arrow for. And when the arrow hit, when the steel point entered my chest 2 inches below my left collarbone, and I fell forward onto the ceremonial platform with my blood spreading across the marble in front of 300 witnesses, the king I was dying for was the king who was going to kill me. My name is Aurelia Thorne. I was 30, Omega, and I had been the crown advisor to Alpha King Lysander Crow for 2 years, the youngest person and the first woman to hold the position in the Crow dynasty's history. The appointment had been controversial. The court preferred advisors who were male, alpha, and from established political families. I was none of these things. I was the daughter of a provincial school teacher, educated on a scholarship, recruited into government through a civil service examination where I scored the highest marks in 40 years, and appointed to the advisory position by Lysander himself after I identified a flaw in the Treasury's accounting system that had been hemorrhaging revenue for a decade. The flaw was being exploited by Lord Marcus Ashworth, the master of coin, who had been embezzling crown funds through a network of shell accounts so sophisticated that 3 previous auditors had missed it. I found it in my first week, documented it in my second, presented the findings to the king in my third, and in doing so, made an enemy whose wealth, political connections, and capacity for revenge would spend the next 2 years engineering my destruction from inside the court I was trying to serve. What I did not know, what I would not learn until I was lying in a medical ward with an arrow wound, and the king was standing over my bed with an expression that I had never seen on his face, and that I would later identify as the specific physiological presentation of a man watching his certainties collapse, was that Marcus Ashworth had not simply been embezzling, he had been retaliating. My discovery of his financial crimes had triggered a campaign of manipulation so precise and so patient that it constituted a masterwork of political destruction. Over 22 months, Ashworth had systematically poisoned the king's perception of me, not through obvious accusations, through the particular insidious methodology of a man who understood that the most effective lies are not told but suggested. A document misplaced to imply I had accessed classified military intelligence. A financial transfer routed through an account that appeared to connect me to a hostile foreign territory. A pattern of circumstantial evidence so carefully constructed that it did not require Ashworth to accuse me directly. The evidence accused me, and Ashworth merely ensured the king saw it. Lysander had believed it. This is the part that matters more than the arrow, more than the blood, more than the 300 witnesses who watched me fall. The king had believed that his crown advisor, the woman who worked 18-hour days, who had restructured his treasury, who had identified the embezzlement that Ashworth was now using as a weapon, was a traitor. He had believed it because the evidence was convincing, and because believing it was easier than confronting the alternative, that someone inside his own court was manufacturing a case against the person most effectively serving it. Believing me a traitor required accepting that his advisor was corrupt. The alternative, believing the evidence was fabricated, required accepting that his court contained a conspirator sophisticated enough to manufacture corruption, and that his own judgment was insufficient to detect it. The first option was painful but simple. The second was devastating and complex. Lysander, like most people confronted with competing explanations, chose the simpler story, and the simpler story was killing me in 11 days. Then the arrow came, and the simpler story shattered against the fact that a woman accused of treason had thrown herself between her king and an assassination attempt, without hesitation, without calculation, without the particular self-preserving pause that a traitor would have exhibited when presented with the opportunity to let her accuser die. The arrow hit my chest. The blood spread on the marble, and the king, who had been carrying a dossier of my destruction in his study for 6 months, watched the woman he was planning to execute bleed on a ceremonial platform for him, and the cognitive architecture that had sustained his belief in my guilt collapsed in the time it took for my body to hit the floor. She took an arrow for a king who was 11 days from executing her. Did not know about the dossier, did not know about the fabricated evidence, did not know that the man she was bleeding for had spent 6 months believing she was a traitor. The arrow shattered the story, because traitors do not take arrows for the people they are betraying. And the king, watching her blood spread across his marble, felt his certainties collapse in the time it took her body to hit the floor. Chapter 1. The poisoning of Lysander's mind had been gradual, architectural, and devastating in its craftsmanship. Marcus Ashworth was not a blunt instrument. He was a surgeon. He understood that destroying a person's reputation with a king required not the brute force of accusation but the delicate, persistent application of doubt. Doubt is a solvent. Applied consistently over time, it dissolves the bonds of trust that hold relationships together without leaving visible marks on the surface. The relationship appears intact. The trust appears functional. But underneath, the structure has been weakened to the point where a single additional weight, a final piece of evidence, a last suggestive detail, causes the collapse that the solvent has been preparing for months. The first drop of doubt was administered 8 months into my tenure. A classified military document, a deployment schedule for the northern border garrison, appeared in a filing cabinet in my office. Not in my desk, not in my personal files, in a shared cabinet that any staff member could access, placed there by Ashworth's aide during a routine file delivery. The document was discovered during a security audit. I was cleared. The investigation found no evidence that I had accessed or used the document, and Commander Enos Valdez concluded that the filing was likely a clerical error. But the clearance was not the point. The point was that the king now associated my office with the presence of a classified document that should not have been there. The first drop of doubt. Invisible on the surface, corrosive underneath. The second drop came 4 months later. A financial transfer from a Crow treasury account to a bank in the Varnath territory, a hostile foreign power, was traced through an intermediary account that shared a numerical sequence with my civil service identification number. Again, investigation found no direct connection. Again, I was cleared. But the association was planted. Aurelia Thorne. Varnath. Money. The drops accumulated. A meeting I was documented attending that I had not attended. Forged entry logs created by Ashworth's network. A letter bearing my handwriting, expertly forged, expressing dissatisfaction with the king's border policy in terms that could be interpreted as disloyalty. A witness paid, I would later discover, who testified to seeing me in a restricted area of the Citadel at a time when I was verifiably elsewhere, but whose testimony was filed before my alibi could be checked. 22 months of drops. Each one individually dismissible, collectively devastating. Lysander processed the accumulation the way intelligent people process evidence that challenges their assumptions. Gradually, reluctantly, and with increasing conviction that the evidence must be true because the alternative, that someone was manufacturing it, seemed less plausible than the simpler explanation that his trusted advisor was not what she appeared. The transition in his behavior was subtle. I noticed it because noticing was my profession. I had been hired specifically for my ability to detect patterns, and the pattern of a king's withdrawing trust is unmistakable to someone trained to read political atmospheres. The morning briefings grew shorter, the policy discussions became less collaborative. The particular warmth that Lysander had shown me during our first year, the warmth of a king who had found an advisor whose competence he genuinely valued, cooled into professional distance, and the distance widened month by month until, by the time the arrow struck, the king and his advisor occupied the same space but inhabited different realities. His reality, she is a traitor I will soon arrest. My reality, something has changed, but I do not know what. I asked him once. 6 weeks before the arrow, we were in his study reviewing the quarterly intelligence assessment, the same study where the dossier of my destruction lived in a locked drawer 12 inches from my chair, and I said, "You have been distant, for months. Have I done something wrong?" He looked at me, and the look, I can describe it now with the precision of someone who has spent years analyzing that moment, was the look of a man who believed he was looking at a traitor and who was experiencing the dissonance of the traitor asking whether she had done something wrong. The look contained contempt, confusion, and a very small, very suppressed flicker of something that I would later identify as doubt. Not doubt about my guilt, doubt about his certainty. The flicker of a man whose evidence was compelling, but whose instinct, buried under 22 months of manufactured proof, was whispering that something did not fit. "No," he said, "you have done nothing wrong." He lied to my face. And I believed him, because I trusted him the way I trusted the evidence I gathered and the intelligence I analyzed. Completely, professionally, with the specific faith of a person who builds their world on the assumption that the people they serve are honest. The assumption was wrong, the trust was misplaced, and in 11 days the trust would have killed me. Instead, an arrow did it first. 22 months of manufactured doubt, each drop individually dismissible, collectively devastating, a classified document planted in her office, forged letters, paid witnesses, and the king, trained to process evidence, not trained to question its source, chose the simpler story. She was a traitor. She asked him once, "Have I done something wrong?" He lied to her face. 11 days later, she took an arrow for the lie. Chapter 2. The assassination attempt occurred at the Autumn Sovereignty Ceremony, an annual public event where the king addressed the territory from the Citadel's ceremonial platform. 300 attendees, full security detail, and a single archer positioned in the bell tower of the adjacent cathedral, a position that Commander Valdez's security sweep had cleared 6 hours earlier, and that the assassin had accessed through a maintenance corridor that was not on the security maps because the cathedral's architectural records had not been updated in 40 years. The security failure was not incompetence, it was infrastructure, the particular mundane kind of vulnerability that exists in every system and that becomes lethal when someone with the right knowledge exploits it. I saw the movement before anyone else. Not because I was looking for it, because I was trained to look for everything. 2 years of intelligence work had calibrated my perception to detect anomalies in environments the way a musician detects wrong notes in a chord. The movement in the bell tower was a wrong note, a shift of light against stone that should not have been there, a shadow that moved when the architecture should have been still. I processed the anomaly in approximately 1.5 seconds, identified the threat in approximately 2, and acted in approximately 0.3, because the action, moving between the king and the threat, was not a decision. It was a reflex, the reflex of a person whose body had been trained to protect, and whose training did not consult her conscious mind before deploying. I stepped in front of Lysander, turned my body to shield his, and the arrow that was aimed at the king's heart entered my chest instead, 2 inches below my left collarbone, angled downward, penetrating the pectoral muscle and lodging against the rib beneath. The impact was not what I expected, not the dramatic cinematic explosion of pain that stories describe. A thud, a pressure, the sensation of something being where it should not be, followed by the spreading warmth of blood and the particular cognitive clarity that trauma produces in the seconds before shock takes over. I looked down at the arrow in my chest, looked at the king behind me, untouched, alive, staring at me with an expression that I did not have time to read, because the ground was approaching. I fell. The marble was cold against my face. The blood was warm against my chest. And the last coherent thought I had before consciousness departed was not about the arrow or the pain or the man I had taken it for. It was about the quarterly intelligence report I had been preparing to deliver that afternoon, which was now going to be late, and which contained, in its final section, an analysis of financial irregularities in Lord Ashworth's accounts that I had been investigating independently for 3 months and that, had I delivered it, would have exposed the very conspiracy that was 11 days from executing me. The report was in my office, on my desk, finished, and I was on a marble floor with an arrow in my chest, thinking about a deadline, because that is who I was, a person who worked. Even while dying, the immediate aftermath was chaos. Commander Valdez's security team secured the platform. The assassin was pursued and captured in the cathedral. A hired mercenary with no political affiliation, paid through an intermediary account, that the investigation would eventually trace back to the same network that Ashworth used for his embezzlement. The irony was architectural. The man who had been poisoning the king against me had also arranged the assassination attempt against the king, because Ashworth's plan had always been larger than my destruction. My destruction was a means. The end was the throne itself. Remove the advisor who was getting too close to his financial network. Then remove the king whose replacement, Ashworth had been cultivating the king's cousin as a puppet successor, would be more amenable to Ashworth's continued access to the treasury. I was not the target. I was the obstacle, and the king was the prize. Lysander caught me as I fell. This detail was reported by 17 witnesses and confirmed by the ceremonial footage that the Citadel's archivists maintained. The king moved the moment the arrow struck, not toward safety, not behind the security cordon that was forming around the platform, but toward me. Caught my body before it completed its fall, held me against his chest on the marble floor while his security team secured the perimeter and the physician was summoned, and the 300 witnesses processed the sight of a king holding his bleeding advisor with the desperate grip of a man whose carefully constructed understanding of the world had just been penetrated by something more compelling than evidence, the physical fact of a woman bleeding for him. The woman he believed was a traitor, bleeding on his ceremonial robes, for him. The evidence said traitor. The blood said otherwise, and the blood was harder to argue with than a dossier. She saw the shadow 1.5 seconds before anyone, stepped between the arrow and the king without consulting her conscious mind. The arrow struck. She fell. He caught her, not running to safety but toward her, held her on the marble while she bled. The evidence said traitor. The blood said otherwise, and the blood was harder to argue with than a dossier. Chapter 3. I survived because the arrow missed the subclavian artery by 11 millimeters. Dr. Linneo Akafor, the palace physician, told me this when I woke 3 days later in the medical ward with a chest wound, a morphine drip, and the king of the Crow territories sitting beside my bed, looking like a man who had not slept since the arrow struck, and whose internal architecture had undergone the kind of seismic restructuring that changes the shape of everything built on top of it. 11 millimeters, Dr. Okafor said. If the arrow had entered 11 millimeters to the left, it would have severed the artery and you would have died on the platform in approximately 90 seconds. I looked at the ceiling. 11 millimeters, I repeated. Between me and the quarterly report being permanently late. Dr. Okafor stared at me, then left the room, muttering about patients whose first post-arrow concern was a deadline, and I was alone with the king. He looked terrible, not the composed, strategic controlled king who had been withdrawing his trust for months. A wrecked version, unshaven, hollow-eyed, wearing the specific physiological markers of a man who had been sitting in a chair for 3 days processing the demolition of a belief system that had governed his behavior for 22 months. He did not speak immediately, sat in the chair beside my bed, and looked at me with an expression that I was now alert enough to read. Devastation. Not the political devastation of a king whose ceremony had been attacked. The personal devastation of a man who had been preparing to execute a woman who had just taken an arrow for him, and who was now lying in a medical bed making jokes about a late report. The cognitive dissonance was visible, a man trying to reconcile traitor with the woman who bled for me, and finding that the reconciliation was not possible. The two stories could not coexist. One of them was a lie, and the arrow had told him which one. The report, I said, on my desk. The financial analysis. Have someone deliver it to Commander Valdez? He blinked. You have an arrow wound, and you are asking about a report. The report contains evidence that Lord Ashworth has been operating a financial network through the Treasury that connects to the Varnoth intermediary accounts, I said. The same accounts that were used to fabricate the evidence linking me to Varnoth. The same network that, based on the preliminary trace I completed before the ceremony, was also used to pay the assassin who shot me. He went still, the stillness of a man whose demolition had just been given a specific architectural explanation. The evidence against me was manufactured, I continued, by Ashworth. Over 22 months, the classified document in my filing cabinet was planted by his aide. The financial transfer to Varnoth was routed through my identification number by his network. The forged letter used a handwriting sample he obtained from personnel files he accessed as master of coin. The witness who placed me in the restricted area was paid through the same intermediary accounts. I know this because I have been investigating Ashworth's financial network for 3 months. The investigation is in the report. On my desk, which I would have delivered 3 days ago if I had not been occupied with an arrow. The silence in the medical ward was the silence of a man hearing the truth for the first time in 22 months, and feeling every decision he had made during those months recontextualized simultaneously. Every morning briefing he had shortened. Every policy discussion he had curtailed. Every moment of distance he had imposed on a woman who was working 18-hour days to serve him while he compiled a dossier to destroy her. The silence contained the specific terrible mathematics of trust betrayed. Not my trust in him, though that was broken, but his trust in his own judgment. He had believed the evidence. He had been wrong, and being wrong had nearly cost the life of the person who was more loyal to him than anyone in his court. Lysander stood from the chair, walked to the window, stood with his back to me, and the tension in his shoulders, the physical manifestation of a man containing something that could not be safely released in a room with a recovering patient, was visible from my bed. I was going to have you arrested, he said. His voice was flat, controlled, the control of a man managing an emotion that, if expressed at its actual volume, would have been audible in the corridor, in 11 days, for treason, based on evidence that Ashworth manufactured. Evidence, I believed, because it was convincing, and because believing it was simpler than believing that someone inside my own court was sophisticated enough to fabricate it. He turned from the window. "You took an arrow for me," he said, "while I was planning your execution. You stepped between me and death while I was 11 days from sentencing you to it." I looked at him. At the man I had served for 2 years, the man whose treasury I had fixed, whose intelligence I had restructured, whose council meetings I had attended since dawn for 730 mornings, the man who had believed I was a traitor and who was now standing in my hospital room confronting the fact that his belief had been a weapon wielded against both of us by the actual traitor. "I did not know," I said, "about the dossier, about the arrest, about any of it. I took the arrow because you were in danger and I was standing where I always stand, 18 inches behind your left shoulder. The position did not change because your feelings about me changed. My job did not change because your trust did. I served you the same on the day you believed I was loyal as on the day you believed I was a traitor, because the service was never about your belief. It was about my commitment, and my commitment does not have a condition that says unless the king is planning to kill me." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were bright. "I am sorry," he said. The 2 words were inadequate. He knew they were inadequate. The inadequacy was part of their honesty. A man offering the only words available while understanding that no words could bridge the distance between "I was planning your execution" and "I am sorry." "I know," I said. "Knowing is not the same as forgiving." "I know that too," he said. She woke from the arrow wound and asked about the report that contained the evidence exposing Ashworth, the same man who had poisoned the king against her. The king stood at the window and said, "I was going to have you arrested in 11 days. You took an arrow while I was planning your execution." She said, "My commitment does not have a condition that says unless the king is planning to kill me." He said, "I am sorry." She said, "Knowing is not the same as forgiving." Chapter 4. Commander Valdez retrieved the report from my desk within the hour. The financial analysis, 3 months of independent investigation conducted during the pre-dawn hours that I worked before the morning briefings that Lysander had been shortening, was comprehensive, meticulous, and devastating. It documented Ashworth's entire network, the embezzlement channels, the intermediary accounts, the connections to the Varnoth territory, and the specific mechanisms he had used to fabricate the evidence against me. It also documented, in a section I had titled Anomalies in Evidence Provenance, that I had intended to present to the king before the arrest I did not know was coming, the forensic analysis proving that every piece of evidence in my supposed treason case had been manufactured. The classified document bore fingerprints from Ashworth's aide. The financial transfers routing contained coding signatures from Ashworth's treasury access protocols. The forged letters' ink composition matched stock purchased by Ashworth's office, and the assassin, captured alive in the cathedral, confirmed under interrogation that his payment had been arranged through the same network, by the same man, for the same purpose. Remove the advisor, then remove the king. Ashworth was arrested that evening, not by Commander Valdez, by Lysander personally. The king walked to the Master of Coin's quarters, flanked by guards, and arrested the man who had spent 22 months poisoning his mind, and who had attempted to kill him, and who had nearly succeeded in executing an innocent woman through the careful, patient, surgical application of manufactured evidence. Ashworth, confronted with the financial analysis that I had compiled from a hospital bed 3 days after taking an arrow, did not deny it. He did something worse. He was surprised. "You found it?" he said, looking at the report. She found it. From a hospital bed. 3 days after being shot. The surprise in his voice was the particular surprise of a man who had underestimated an opponent so thoroughly that even the evidence of his defeat did not fully register as plausible. He had manufactured 22 months of evidence against me, and I had dismantled it in 3 months of pre-dawn work while simultaneously performing the advisory role he was trying to destroy. The mismatch between his estimation of my ability and my actual ability was the gap through which his entire conspiracy fell. The trial was public. The evidence was presented, both the fabricated case against me and the real case against Ashworth. The court watched both stories unfold simultaneously, the lie that had been built over 22 months and the truth that had been documented in 3. The contrast was damning, not just for Ashworth but for the system that had allowed his manipulation to succeed. The king's intelligence apparatus, designed to detect external threats, had been completely blind to an internal conspiracy conducted by a man who sat in council meetings every week and who had used his position's access to manufacture a treason case against a colleague. The failure was systemic, and the system's most visible representative, The king, who had believed the manufactured evidence, sat through the trial watching the dismantling of his own judgment with the particular, public, unflinching accountability of a man who had decided that his failure deserved to be witnessed. Ashworth was convicted of embezzlement, conspiracy, attempted assassination of the crown, and the fabrication of evidence against a crown official. The sentence was life imprisonment. The puppet successor he had been cultivating, the king's cousin Lord Stellan, who had been an unwitting participant in Ashworth's broader strategy, was cleared of involvement and quietly removed from the succession line as a precautionary measure. And the dossier, the case file that Lysander had been building against me for 6 months, the document that would have resulted in my arrest and execution in 11 days, was publicly destroyed. Not sealed, not classified, not filed away, where its existence could be denied. Destroyed. Burned in the Great Hall's ceremonial fire while the court watched, because Lysander understood that the destruction needed to be as public as the belief had been private. The court had not known about the dossier, but the court would know about its destruction, and the destruction would communicate what an apology could not. The king had been wrong. The evidence was fake, and the woman who took the arrow was innocent. The report she wrote from a hospital bed dismantled 22 months of manufactured evidence. Ashworth was arrested by the king personally, convicted of everything, and the dossier, the case for her execution, was burned publicly in the Great Hall, because the destruction needed to be as public as the belief had been private. Chapter 5. I resigned as Crown Advisor the day I was released from the medical ward, not because the position was untenable, it was, but that was not why. Because the woman who had held the position for 2 years was not the same woman who left the hospital. The arrow had changed me, not the wound, but what the wound had revealed. I had taken an arrow for a man who was planning to kill me. I had served with total commitment a person who was compiling my destruction. I had worked 18-hour days for a king who shortened my briefings because he believed I was a traitor. And I had done all of this without knowing, which meant I had done it sincerely. The service was real even though the trust it was built on was fraudulent. The sincerity was mine. The fraud was his. And living inside that asymmetry, carrying the knowledge that my most genuine professional commitment had been received by a man who was simultaneously planning my execution, was a wound that the arrow had made visible but had not created. The wound had been there for 22 months. I was just the last person to know about it. Lysander did not accept the resignation. This is not the same as saying he refused it. He did not have the authority to refuse. And he understood that asserting authority over a woman whose autonomy he had nearly destroyed would have been the final violation in a chain of violations that his failure of judgment had enabled. What he did was ask, sit with him in his study, the same study where the dossier had lived, where the locked drawer that had contained my death sentence was now empty, and talk. Not about the position, about the damage. I believed you were a traitor, he said. For 22 months, I attended meetings with you, read your reports, received your briefings, and the entire time I was cataloging evidence against you, watching you for confirmation of a guilt I had already decided was real. Every word you said, I filtered through the assumption that you were lying. Every analysis you provided, I checked for hidden agendas. Every morning you walked into this study, I looked at you and thought, she is betraying me, while you were saving my treasury, restructuring my intelligence, serving me with a competence that I was too blinded by suspicion to appreciate. He looked at his hands. I did not confront you, he continued, did not give you the opportunity to defend yourself, did not present the evidence and ask for your response, because confrontation would have required me to look at you and accuse you to your face. And somewhere, in some part of my judgment that the evidence had not fully corrupted, I could not do it. Could not look at the woman who arrived at dawn every morning and worked until midnight, and tell her that I believed she was a traitor. The inability was not mercy, it was cowardice. I could not face the possibility that your response would be convincing, because a convincing defense would have required me to re-examine the evidence, and re-examining the evidence would have required me to consider that it was fabricated. And considering fabrication would have required me to accept that I had been manipulated for 22 months by a man I trusted. Believing you were guilty was painful. Believing I had been fooled was worse. So I chose the pain I could bear over the truth I could not. I listened, did not interrupt, did not perform forgiveness or demand further contrition. Listened with the professional attention that had been my defining characteristic for 2 years, and that the arrow had not damaged because the arrow had hit my chest, not my mind. When he finished, I said, you chose the simpler story, the one that required one person to be corrupt rather than one person to be corrupt, and your judgment to be compromised. He nodded, and the simpler story nearly killed me. Yes, I need you to sit with that, I said. Not for a day or a week, for a long time. Because the damage was not the dossier or the 11 days or even the arrow. The damage was 22 months of serving someone who was filtering everything I said through the assumption that I was lying. 22 months of my competence being received as manipulation. 22 months of my commitment being interpreted as cover for treason. That is not a mistake that an apology corrects. It is a failure that changes the foundation of what trust means between us. If there is going to be an us, professional or otherwise, the foundation must be rebuilt from materials that are not the same materials it was built from before, because the old materials failed. He looked at me. The look was not the contempt of 6 months ago, not the bewildered devastation of the hospital room. It was the look of a man standing at the beginning of something he understood would be long, difficult, and uncertain. The rebuilding of a trust he had destroyed by believing it was the other person who had destroyed it. What materials, he asked. Transparency, I said. Every piece of evidence that crosses your desk about any person in your court is presented to that person for response before you act on it. Every accusation is investigated by Commander Valdez independently, not filtered through the accused person's political rivals. Every conclusion you reach about someone's loyalty is tested against their behavior, not just against the evidence in your drawer. He nodded. And between us specifically? Between us specifically, I said, you start by understanding that I am not coming back to the advisory position because you ask me to. I am coming back. If I come back, because the reforms you implement convince me that what happened to me cannot happen to anyone else. The system failed. Not just your judgment, the system. And the system is what I fix. So fix it, and I will consider returning to fix more of it. He leaned back. That sounds like a condition. It sounds like the minimum standard for working with a king who nearly executed you based on fabricated evidence, I corrected. He almost smiled. The first expression in the conversation that was not devastation. Then I will meet the standard, he said. Because the alternative, governing without the person who identified the embezzlement, restructured the intelligence, and compiled the evidence that exposed the conspiracy while recovering from an arrow wound, is a standard of governance I am not interested in maintaining. She did not forgive quickly. The damage was 22 months of my competence being received as manipulation. She set conditions. Transparency, independent investigation, every accusation presented to the accused before action. He said, I will meet the standard. Because governing without the woman who solved the conspiracy from a hospital bed was a standard he refused to maintain. Chapter 6. I returned to the advisory position 4 months later. Not because Lysander asked, because the reforms he implemented met my conditions, and the conditions were the foundation, and the foundation needed to be solid before anything could be built on it. The transparency protocols were in place. The independent investigation framework was operational. The system that had allowed Ashworth's manipulation had been identified, documented, and restructured with the particular thoroughness that the Crow Crown applied to military campaigns, and that I insisted be applied to internal governance with equal intensity. The system was better. Not perfect. Systems are never perfect, but better. And better, built on the rubble of the worst failure I had ever experienced, was sufficient to return to. The love came from the rebuilding. Not beside it, not despite it. From it. From the shared, painstaking, uncomfortable work of two people constructing trust from materials that were stronger than the ones that had failed. From the morning briefings that Lysander no longer shortened, that he extended, actively, asking questions, engaging with my analysis, performing the specific attention that he had withheld for 22 months, and that he now provided with the deliberate overcorrection of a man atoning for inattention through its opposite. From the evening reviews where he presented every piece of intelligence that crossed his desk and asked my assessment before forming his own, not because he did not trust his judgment, but because he had learned that judgment uninformed by the people it affects is judgment that can be weaponized. From the particular, daily, unglamorous intimacy of two people who had been through the worst possible professional betrayal and who had chosen, despite the damage, to work together again. The choice was not romantic. It was structural. And the structure, built slowly and with the specific care that only people who have experienced structural failure can provide, became the foundation for something that neither of us had planned, and that both of us eventually recognized as love. He told me in the study, the same study where the dossier had lived, where the locked drawer was now permanently open. Lysander had removed the lock the day after the burning, and the drawer remained open as a physical reminder that secret cases against the people you work with are a form of violence that this office would never again contain. I love you, he said. I set down the intelligence brief I was reviewing. You are telling me this in the room where you kept my death sentence. Yes, Because this room should hold the opposite of what it held before, and the opposite of a secret case for your destruction is an honest declaration of what I feel, which is that you are the most extraordinary person I have ever worked with, and the fact that I spent 22 months interpreting your extraordinary commitment as evidence of treason is the greatest failure of perception I will ever commit. And I am telling you I love you not because the words undo the failure, but because the failure taught me what the words actually mean. They mean, I see you clearly now, without the filter, without the assumption, without the simpler story that protects me from the complex truth. The complex truth is that you took an arrow for a man who was going to kill you, and that act of loyalty, incomprehensible, unreasonable, given without the knowledge that would have made self-preservation the rational choice, changed everything I understand about trust. I do not trust evidence anymore. I trust behavior. And your behavior, Aurelia, every morning at dawn, every 18-hour day, every arrow, has been the most trustworthy thing in my life. I loved you before I knew I loved you. I suspected you while I loved you. And I am standing here now, in the room where I kept your death, telling you that I love you because this room should know what love sounds like. It has heard enough of the other thing. I looked at the open drawer, at the room that had contained my destruction and now contained its opposite, at the man who had failed me more profoundly than anyone ever had, and who was rebuilding more honestly than anyone ever could. I love you too, I said. And I need you to understand that the love does not erase the 22 months, it coexists with them. I love you and I carry the damage, and both things are true simultaneously, and will be true for the rest of our lives. The arrow scar on my chest does not heal into nothing. It heals into a scar, and the scar is part of the body, part of the story, part of us. He crossed the room, took my hand, the hand that had written the report that saved us both, the hand that had gestured through 1,000 diplomatic conversations, the hand that had pressed against the arrow wound on a marble floor while the king she was bleeding for was 11 days from killing her. I will carry the scar with you, he said, not because I deserve to share it, because carrying it alone is something you have done long enough. Epilogue. 3 years later, our daughter was born with my analytical mind and Lysander's strategic focus, a combination that the court found both promising and slightly alarming. We named her Linnea, after Dr. Okafor, who had measured the 11 millimeters between the arrow and the artery, and who had, through that measurement, quantified the distance between everything we lost and everything we kept. Baby Linnea would grow up in a court where transparency was law, where secret dossiers were prohibited, where every accusation was investigated independently before it reached the king's desk. She would grow up in a system that her mother had been nearly killed by and had then rebuilt from the inside. And the rebuilding, not the arrow, not the romance, not the dramatic narrative of a woman bleeding for a king who was planning her death, was the real story. Because arrows are moments, systems are permanent. And the system her mother built would protect people long after the scar had faded, and the story had been told, and the woman who took the arrow had become a name in a history that her daughter would read and her granddaughter would inherit. The arrow scar remained on my chest. I did not hide it. Wore necklines that revealed it during court functions, not as a performance, but as a record. The scar said, "This happened. A woman served a king with total commitment, while the king compiled her destruction based on lies he chose to believe, because the lies were simpler than the truth. She took an arrow for him anyway, not because she knew about the dossier, because commitment does not have conditions. And the scar, visible, permanent, carried on a body that had been 11 millimeters from death, was the only evidence that could not be fabricated, could not be manufactured, could not be planted or forged or routed through intermediary accounts. The scar was real. The loyalty was real, and the truth, which had taken 22 months and an arrow to surface, was the only thing in the whole story that had never been a lie. The lady who took an arrow for the Alpha King, unaware his heart was full of poison towards her. She survived by 11 millimeters, exposed the conspiracy from a hospital bed, reformed the system that nearly killed her, and the king, who had believed the simpler story for 22 months, learned that the complex truth is always worth the discomfort, because the simpler story nearly destroyed the most loyal person in his court, and the arrow scar on her chest was the only evidence in the entire story that could not be fabricated.